Hello and welcome to this breakdown video where I will go through the process of making a 3D character sculpt in Blender. This isn't intended as a step-by-step tutorial, but more so a presentation of my workflow, which will include a few tips and tricks. And fingers crossed there's a few things you can also take away and use in your own work. Just for context before I dive in, this character sculpt was made in the context of an art jam with some friends, and is not by any means game ready or suitable for an animation. The objective was more so to just create a still image render. Just something to keep in mind then, that my workflow will mostly center around that specific context. Cool, let's get started. So with a detailed character such as this one, I usually like to create a base mesh using subdivision modeling on simple shapes just to approximate as much as possible the final sculpt as I see it in my head, without having to actually use any destructive processes that are involved in sculpting. This allows me to always be able to tweak a few vertices instead of using brushes. Some people might be more comfortable with taking as little time as possible in the base mesh process and then refining all the silhouette details with brushes in sculpt mode. I personally prefer to use subdivision modeling as much as possible, as I find that a more reliable and accurate base mesh is always less hassle in terms of nailing down the proportions and the basic silhouette first. So as you can see right now, it's as simple as a process as just adding a few blobs here and there to define the large features of the character I'm trying to sculpt. At this stage, I already find it quite good to start using reference, as I would like for even some basic shapes like the ears, for instance, to be grounded, not really in reality, but to follow some kind of logic and understand how the ears connect to the head, where the ears sit on the face. Of course, there's a lot of creative liberties taken into adapting real-life photography into this kind of style, but I find that real-life reference, even at this stage, really early in the process, can help a lot. Of course, make sure you use a mirror modifier for any shapes that will be symmetrical across the body. And don't worry about pose for now. The idea is just to make an A pose, as the posing process will be way later in my workflow. Another important thing to keep in mind at this stage is to make sure you always view your model from loads of different angles. This is why the viewport right now is spinning so much in the time-lapse view, because at an early stage like that, you really want to make sure you're not forgetting to work on the side view, for instance, or the back. Otherwise, you might get some nasty surprises later. Skipping ahead just a little bit here, but you can see later on in the base mesh modeling process, I'm starting to get a better feel of the main curves and main shapes that are going to kind of create the silhouette of this shape. I really liked having an arc in the inside of the arms that kind of curves inwards, while the outside of the arms have these two little curves that bow outwards. A lot of this is figured out simply through trial and error, which is why, for me at least, the base mesh process usually takes so long. My advice here would really be at this stage to try out different proportions if you're kind of not quite sure what you want to go for. You might stumble on something you really like and you didn't expect you would want to do. This is really the stage where you can try out as many things as possible. Make sure you don't work on one singular thing and try and consider that model as a whole. You can see there I'm doing some early attempts for the eye sockets, but it didn't look really good, so I tried another method later. A little tip here, if you're modeling using subdivision surface, is to use the edge crease feature. It allows you to do some kind of sharper edges in places that you want the silhouette to be a bit more defined, maybe. The chest, for instance, here. It's important to know as well, throughout the creation of this character, I'm working with some previous drawings that were made by other artists. Since I'm modeling an already existing OC, I can base myself off quite a lot of already existing material, which is quite useful, but there is also a lot of space for interpretation. It's really about adapting the design to your own style and maybe bringing to it your own unique ideas and expressing yourself as an artist, which is important. At this point, I was getting really happy with the overall shape of the silhouette and the character in general. So I thought it would be a good idea to start painting over a face using the grease pencil feature. Blender's grease pencil is really good. I recommend using it not even for final products, but sometimes just for sketching on a model. Like here, for instance, I'm getting the general shape of the hair down in preparation for the modeling process later. I also find adding a face to your models as early as possible gives you motivation somehow, or really helps you imagine better what the model would look like. And as you can see here, I'm just scribbling around on the face and trying to bring some features out. Instantly, with just a little bit of effort, I can get something that's already pretty good looking. Again, scribbling with the grease pencil is just for visualization purposes. It's not something I'm actually going to use in the final render. It's just nice to have there as a template for modeling and for reference later. My first step for sculpting is to first create the eye sockets, and for that I use the masking feature so I can basically push in just the eyes without affecting the rest of the head model. It's at this part of the process that I'm happy with the general silhouette of the head and the rest of the body in general. But right before going on to the sculpting process and remeshing the head, I always like to create a duplicate of the base mesh. Remeshing, in case you didn't know, is a process that completely changes the topology of an object. It allows you to add significantly more resolution, which is why it's a very common step to use right before sculpting. The problem with it though is that it's very destructive, as in there's no easy way to revert it if you've remeshed an object. Which is why I like to create a duplicate of the object before I remesh it and add it to a hidden collection. It allows me to always have a way to go back if things go completely horribly wrong. Thanks to my grease pencil sketches at this point in the sculpting process, it's actually quite easy to start building up some features just by referencing what I've already sketched out. I'm also cautiously trying different approaches for features like the eyebrows or the chin. I'm not exactly quite sure how detailed I want the model to be at this point, so I'm just trying different things and not being too fussed about how optimized it is or how clean it looks. The idea is just to get things going and see what works. In that spirit, at this point, the eyes are just UV spheres for now. I will rework them later on in the process to be a little more sophisticated and include different layers. But for now, a simple UV sphere works just as well. Here you can actually see some of that, where I start rebuilding the eyes in hard surface, just by tracing out the contour and using a grid fill and subdividing it and adding a solidify. At this point, I'm already thinking quite a lot about materials, partly because I'm getting impatient and I really want to start working in material view. Materials are my favorite part of the process usually. I find it useful to always kind of have an end product in mind. It can just be like some colors or kind of some patterns that you want to have. I find it quite nice to start thinking about it quite early. Right, now here comes the process of creating the hair. This was, I think, by far the lengthiest process in making the character. This wasn't a technique I had used before, but it actually turned out really well. The way I did the hair, I just used very simple subdivided shapes to serve as not individual hair strands, but like kind of clumps of hair. The character in my reference had kind of curly, frizzy hair, so I thought it would work quite well as well with the rest of the style. To create the hair itself, I first laid out the kind of biggest strands that had the most impact on the silhouette. So like the front-facing fringe, for instance. And then kind of worked my way from there, making the different hair strands follow a natural shape from the top of the head all the way down to the back. All that placing and duplicating was very time-consuming indeed, but I think the final result turned out really well. At this point, I started working a little bit more on the eyes, namely adding the eyelashes. The eyelashes really helped make the general shape of the eye pop out more. The eyelashes were actually really simple to create. It's just the outline of the eye that's been previously modeled, duplicated and converted into a curve. From there, it's quite easy to give it some thickness. And since it's duplicated from the original mesh, it follows the silhouette really well. The iris follows pretty much the same process. It's just the cornea duplicated and scaled down to fit under it. This is the point where I merge the ears with the rest of the head using a remesh modifier. Again, if you use this process, make sure you duplicate whatever you're remeshing and put it in a hidden collection. That way you can always revert it back to its original status if you need to. This is the point where I combine and remesh all the hair strands together. This allowed me to smooth out the transitions between the individual hair strands using a sculpt brush. Overall, I found this allowed me to make the hair kind of stand out as one unified object instead of loads of separate little spikes. It makes the hair feel a bit more organic. I'm using the mask feature here once again to carve out inlets for the ears. At this point, I'm really starting to think more about secondary details and focus less on general shape. Experimenting here with a few materials. I thought the hair BSDF might give interesting results at first, but it really doesn't work unless you're using actual hair particles. I ended up using the principal BSDF on, I think, most surfaces, if not every surface. Except for the cornea, actually, which uses the glass BSDF. Just because it's very kind of simple, toony surfaces, so it didn't really need anything very sophisticated. Using the multiplane scrape brush, I thought it would be a good idea to add a bit more definition to the hair strands. Throughout making the model, I kind of realized a nice mix of large curves but also more jagged edges worked really well. Gave a really nice distribution of detail across the model, which is why you also see me adjusting the eyebrows a little bit to have a bit more sharpness. And in that spirit, I also adjusted a few of the hair strands using the snake hook brush to be a little bit more squiggly, just to make the hair a little bit more frizzy, and I felt like it gave it a lot more character. Again, focusing as much as possible on silhouette here and the most important strands at the front, pouring a lot of attention in those particularly. At this point, I'm really focusing on tinier details on the face, adjusting very minutely specific curves and making some areas way sharper. That's why you see me remeshing the model a lot. I'm constantly trying to give myself enough definition on the mesh to be able to zoom in and work on it some more. And really make sure, especially on the face, which is probably going to be the area of the model that is the most caught by the eye, that every curve and bump looks as clean as possible. Usually with very realistic and organic sculpts, I like to keep a few brush marks and like sculpt marks that I use, especially with the clay strips brush. I like to work the surface a lot more, but here, because the style is very almost plasticky, I like to keep it nice and smooth. Here I figured out adding a secondary eyebrow on the bottom actually framed the eye out really nicely. So that's one of the nice surprises you can get with working with a vague idea in your head, but not completely being set on one specific idea. It's also the advantage of trying different things. You might stumble on ideas or details you really like that you just didn't plan on doing at all at first. And now comes the posing process. Notice here how I do the posing before I actually do the clothes, because the way I do the clothes is I extract the geometry from the body and actually use that for the clothing, so it's way easier if I do the clothes after the character has already been posed. This is actually the opposite of how you would do it for a game character, as you would want the clothes to deform with the body in the rig. But since this is just a single render, I don't have to bother with rigging. Posing is honestly a really exciting step in my workflow because it's the first glimpse of the final render. It also means it's super important, and I usually take a lot of time to pose it. I will probably cut a lot of it here because it's just a lot of me moving limbs around for an hour-ish. I find posing to usually work hand in hand with lighting, so I tend to work on both at the same time. And the keyword here really is just, again, silhouette. A clear, readable silhouette really does a lot, even if it's a simple pose. I unfortunately didn't record the process of me doing materials for the face, so if you're wondering how I did that, I actually have a little bit of footage later on where I do the same material setup for the arms and legs, so hopefully I can explain it a little bit more later. And we're finally onto clothing now. So the way my workflow for clothing works is very much the same as making the character itself. So I start with basic shapes that have a subdivision surface modifier. And then once I'm happy with the general shape of it, that's only when I will convert it to a sculptable object and sculpt folds into it. So I start with very basic shapes, nice rounded blobs that I stretch around the body in a vaguely cloth-like manner. So I try to factor in the weight of the cloth, kind of where it's gonna sit on the character's limbs. But of course, if you can, don't feel like you have to make the clothes from scratch. Here, for instance, the character's jumper was literally made from a duplicate of the torso. And you can see here the character is really coming together now. When you're making materials for clothes, it's sometimes really nice to use the sheen slider on the principled BSDF shader. It adds a nice highlight to the edges that's very similar to velvet, and I find it could be a very nice addition to cloth-like materials. On a more general note now, there's no specific moment in my work, and I think in a lot of people's work as well, where you clearly go from one step to another, unless you're working with very technical processes where you have to do things in a very specific order. I think I find that most people in a more creative project like this really go in and out of different steps. You might work on lighting for a little bit and then go back into sculpting, then work on something else. There's really no clear switch from one step of the workflow to another one. I find it quite nice on these kind of projects to work on the whole thing as a culmination of all these little processes. And as you progress through your project, like slowly move towards sculpting details or slowly move towards considering lighting or pose, you might find yourself going back and forth a lot. There's nothing wrong with that. Here, using the color ramp node, I figured out I could add an outline to the exterior of the iris, which I ended up keeping. I thought it looked really awesome. It really went well with how the eyelashes framed the eye. and added that extra little bit of contrast that was lacking in the eyes. For the little technical breakdown on how I'm texturing all of this, not just the eyes, but also the split between the brown parts of the face and the white parts of the face, and all these gradients that you can kind of see subtly in the hair and the rest of the body. I'm basically using vertex paint mode, so I'm just painting in black and white different areas I'd like to assign different colors to, and then in my material graph I'm using the attribute nodes to get that data and drive it through a color ramp node, which is super powerful. You can basically use it to map any sort of value to any color, so that's how I'm tweaking on the fly the gradient of the eye. It's also why I don't paint directly on textures. First of all, I don't want to UV unwrap, but even if I were to paint using vertex colors directly, I don't have that control. I don't have access to the colors that I can change on the fly. Using masks driven through color ramps in that way makes it way closer to like a layer-based system that you would have on Photoshop, for instance. So it allows for much more control, and since I love tweaking things on the fly, it's way more adapted to my way of working. Once I'm happy with the general shape of my clothes, that's the point when I start pulling and pushing in some folds into the cloth using sculpt mode. I used to be really nervous doing cloth folds. I used to think it was the hardest thing ever because it's so physical. It seemed to me like there was so many properties that I had to take into account. There's a few tips and tricks I learned that really helped a lot. The first one is to consider where the cloth falls onto the body. So think of your shoulders, your chest, for instance. That will tend to have flatter, less defined folds, whereas areas where the cloth is loose will have more defined, deeper folds. So think of your stomach area, for instance, or your armpits where cloth will be looser. You also want to think about where the cloth bunches up, so that could be the end of your sleeve, depending if you have a very oversized sweater, for instance. A lot of cloth might accumulate there and you want to put higher density folds. I'm doing all the folds here using the Draw Sharp brush. I find it to be a very useful brush because you really don't need any extra setup. It's very intuitive. If you want to make a long fold between the shoulders, for instance, you can just draw one arc as you would normally and then another arc pushing in, and just like that you'll have a perfectly good fold right out of the box. And I'm essentially just using that technique throughout the entire model. Every now and again, you might want to readjust the general silhouette of your clothes, and that's really easy too. You can just use the grab brush and do little adjustments on the fly, like I've done with the sleeve here. Working on the dungarees here, the setup is basically the same, even though the shape is a little more complex. Because I imagine the dungarees to be a bit more like denim, I'm making the folds a bit less defined and maybe making the creases between the folds a bit larger. You can see here as well with the Draw Sharp brush, I'm adding a bit of a sharpness to the pant legs, kind of as if they've been freshly ironed or something. I feel like it added a really nice touch again with the distribution of detail between sharp and nicely rounded that this character has been getting a lot. Here, using the Draw Sharp brush again, I'm actually drawing in some sewing marks, so I'm actively looking at reference here for the clothes. Again, super important to look at reference. I felt like adding some sewing lines here would work really well to add a bit more extra detail. We're really getting closer to the end now. I'm adding in a few buttons and hard surface details that I can't really do in sculpt mode properly. So the little connection here between the dungarees and the strap. Essentially, it's a very thin tube, so I'm not fussing myself with actually making the cylinder wrap around. I'm just tracing it around with an edge and converting it into a curve. And then in your curve properties, you can just add some thickness to it. It's very easy. I felt like the sewing mark still lacked a little bit of depth here. So using the face set feature, I'm extracting the areas which you would expect to have several layers of cloth on top of each other and just creating an extra object with a bit more thickness. If you're interested in this feature, it's called the extract face sets, which allows you to basically just duplicate any area that you paint in on your sculpt. So that's how I'm doing this extra layer of cloth here around the waist. It needs a bit of cleanup. I'm using the smooth brush, and here I'm kind of cinching it around the body a bit better, but the final result really was worth it. Clothes really are a combination of loads of different layers of textile. I think it's important to make sure that that comes through when you're creating your clothes. Otherwise, if it's just one big flat object, I find that will stand out quite a lot for the wrong reasons. Here's my first attempt at texturing now. I first tried to cheap out using procedural noise, but it didn't really align properly with the rest of the pose and it didn't look very good, so I tried something else a bit later. Here you can see my texturing process that I was describing earlier using vertex paint mode. As you can see, I just, for a quick instant here, painted out the areas that are supposed to be white. And because I'm driving that through a color ramp node, I can assign the different values to brown or white. And to actually create that transition that kind of looks like fur between both those colors, I'm using a noise that I'm mixing with the mask using a soft light node. It's what I'm using on a face as well, and using that I can create procedural streaks across the arms that kind of look like fur in a nicely stylized way. Now I just had the pants left to texture, and it also happens to be the only object I actually UV unwrapped. I just got a nice textile normal map of CCO textures. I'll put a link in the description if you're watching this on YouTube. And essentially, using the shortest path selection feature, it was actually really easy to UV unwrap even a very high density object like that. And if you've done sewing seams as well on your clothes, it's actually really easy to hide the UV seams. You kind of just put them in exactly the same place, and it acts very naturally the same way real life cloth would, which is awesome. I was really pleased with the final result on the dungarees. I love how the texture makes it look like corduroy, and I love as well how I could place the direction of the fabric myself just by rotating the different UV islands, and gives it this really nice little touch. And there we go. Here's the final model, and here's the final render. I went ahead and added a little background, nothing too crazy, and that's it. I hope you enjoyed this little breakdown. Hopefully you managed to learn something or two, or hopefully you just had a good time listening and looking at my process. Let me know if you enjoyed this way of presenting my work. If you have any advice of your own for any next breakdowns I might do, please let me know. This is my very first I'm doing on YouTube here, so hopefully there'll be more coming as I do more projects. If you found me from my TikTok and you're a long-time watcher, I really appreciate that. I'm still around. I'm gonna try and get more stuff out there. Rest assured, I've never stopped doing art or doing projects. I've just slowed down on putting them out there as I've gone from doing small-scale stuff to way larger-scale stuff, and hopefully you'll get to see a bit more of that soon. So again, let me know if you have any feedback, if you want any specific advice on different things in this video. I'd be happy to do more precise hands-on breakdowns. And yeah, that's it from me. Have a good one.